Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
And why I'm saying that is, you were trying to do this with the goal of having long-term customer trust, satisfaction, and brand loyalty. And various corporate functions and business functions play a different role at a different time across all those things. And so their emphasis points may be different, but you want to have everybody involved from the beginning and foster this inclusion so that you get all these various considerations at every phase.
Repeat this mantra. Privacy by design. Privacy by design. Although security by design is a best practice followed by IoT companies in the know, its business counterpart related to risk isn't chanted nearly as often as it should be. Privacy by design should be repeated with every second breath. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Paul Plofchan, Chief Security Officer for ADT, about privacy by design and other privacy best practices.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is for business leaders and managers employing the Internet of Things for their business or the business of their customers. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair, and I interview the industry's leading authorities to find out how they use IoT to improve business and create value. If you like this show, subscribe to it on iTunes and go to iotinc.com to check out my complimentary articles, videos, meetups, and webinars.
I want to use this opportunity to publicly announce for the first time that I'm writing a book about IoT business. And things are going pretty well. I have an agent and interest from a number of major publishers. I've been working on the book since January and just finished my second draft about a week ago. However, after a structural edit, turns out that I still have around 25% to go. Now, soon I'm going to be creating a book review club. So if you'd be interested in getting access to my book early, in exchange for you giving me your feedback, make sure you're on my mailing list. Just sign up at www.iot-inc.com and you'll be hearing about it soon. With me today on the IoT Show is Paul Plofchan. Paul is Vice President of Government Affairs and Chief Privacy Officer for home security company ADT. Paul leads ADT's political engagement and public policy strategy. He's also a leader within the company's data stewardship program focused on fostering customer and employee trust. I met Paul a couple times speaking and introduced him for his keynote at Internet of Things World just a couple months back. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Bruce. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, so have you been on the road lately, or have you been mostly working out of the office?
Well, you know the drill in this. I have been on the road doing a lot of different things. You know, it's legislative sessions are taking place, Washington issues to address, and then, of course, continued work on privacy and Internet of Things. So getting around.
Yeah. So now you're the first chief privacy officer we've had on the show. What does that entail? You've kind of indicated a little bit there, but what does it entail?
So in the chief privacy role, I have the pleasure of working across the organization with my colleagues on all the different functions on how we treat customer data and how we provide the insight and thoughts into the products and services we're bringing to market and what the various privacy considerations that are involved. And then also it dovetails really nicely with the work I do on government affairs because of the greater discussion that's taking place and has been taking place for a while now about various privacy issues, both societal and then, of course, the attention that's being paid to it from a Internet of Things perspective.
Right. And the government seems to be, it's hard to keep on top or keep track or keep on top of the technology, but it seems like they're now getting into full swing on IoT. I know there's been a few documents that have been released. I mean, I guess advice documents. How would you classify kind of the government's approach with IoT at this point in time?
So I think I'd answer that, and I think your direction you're headed is sort of how is what kind of advice is the government giving in terms of B2C, business to consumer device, and I think that's a good way to describe it that can be easily understood by folks. Various governmental agencies, whether they're at the state level in terms of maybe state attorneys generals, California Attorney General, for example, or at the federal level with the FTC or the Department of Commerce. They've all been very involved in the space. They offer a lot of educational materials. They provide helpful tips to consumers online. And then, of course, even in some of the regulatory proposals that get made, there's good information there. And then, of course, even in enforcement actions, when things are, you can learn a lot about what the environment is shaping up, how people are using it, where the holes are, if you will, from those types of actions. But I think the government's been playing a very supportive role there. They hear from consumers, policymakers frequently get phone calls or have notes dropped to them or get spoken to in public spaces about this space as it's relatively new, and a lot of information. I find it very helpful, and then of course, as you mentioned, being on the road, there's a lot of conferences that are taking place, and I've been impressed by policymaker and regulator outreach through that avenue as well.
So, are you seeing IoT coming up in, I guess, other conferences that you're attending, maybe with respect to privacy, or I guess, what's that landscape look like? Certainly,
I think it's occupying a lot of the agenda. So, in terms of privacy meetings that I attend that are strictly for privacy folks like myself, that might be put on by, for example, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, or IAPP. They have regular programs that educate professionals, and the IoT is a very big focus, not only in terms of privacy, but in getting it right. I was recently at IAPP Canada, and then the whole focus was on the analytics aspect of big data. As we collect the data, what are the best practices? What are the legal requirements? What are the customer trust building structures that folks can be building for that? So there's that organization. I also, in my role, have the pleasure of interacting, as I already mentioned, with state attorneys generals, and there are they do consumer protection meetings and other types of meetings where the states are sharing ideas, and there's been a really strong focus for a number of years on that. And then my role also takes me into Washington, D.C., and there is literally, I bet every day these days, a meeting going on in D.C. related to big data and that. And in fact, I just had the pleasure last week of being in D.C. for a few days and stopping by one, and I went there because one of the main talks was all about the Internet of Things, and
is that right?
And what kind of IoT good practices should be put into place. So lots of attention on it, and it's all very helpful. It's a great way to learn, to stay fresh, and contribute. And so I think it's a pretty robust environment. And then, of course, as you also mentioned, where our paths have crossed at some of the Informa meetings that, in IoT World, for example, great focus on it and a great opportunity to work with the developers and listen to them and see where they're going. And I think it's all having a very positive impact.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, Paul, what's your advice for the listeners? Now, obviously, they don't have the opportunity like you do to visit and actually attend these meetings, maybe go to all the conferences. But do our listeners have a mechanism to influence government in privacy, for example?
Well, I think certainly they do. If I, in the group of listeners here who are, let's just take companies that are developing products or they're offering a service.
Right.
they have their own mechanisms through their own channels, but I don't think you have to make it overly complex. There are just regular routine channels using constituent affairs, for example, into DC,
Okay.
where you can talk to that. I find legislators have a growing interest in it. So even, if you're at an organization and you just use your routine constituent affairs mechanisms, I think it'll be well received. For example, there's an effort in DC now, sponsored, very bipartisan effort on some legislation called the Digit Act, and Internet of Things is the core of this. And so there's that mechanism, and then I think through regular business association member, groups, your local chambers of commerce are all good sources, as well as the various, in this particular space of Internet of Things. There's then I'm just thinking of some of the companies in the Valley. There's also great mechanisms there through some of their associations. One being the Internet Society, which is really engaged and offering some really great advice. So I think so.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, it sounds right. So utilizing industry bodies that your company might be part of, and even, I guess, more horizontal bodies like the Internet Society is probably a logical way to kind of get your feelings known, or at least keep on top of things.
Yeah, and even just routine trade association meetings. There's pretty much nobody today not talking. Maybe there's somebody, but the by and large, the Internet of Things and how we get this right and how we bring the most value for consumers, it's being talked about in so many different formats. And then largely that weaves into my space, which is, regulatory and consumer privacy, because they're topics that folks want to talk about, not only for their own companies, but I mean, we're all users of these technologies too.
Sure.
And we're all developing our own belief systems around how we want to use them and how we want our information to be treated, and what's good ground and what's not good ground.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to getting into that stuff. So why don't we start, Paul? Give us a bit of a background about yourself and the background that you have in IoT.
Sure. So I got started in my professional career on the sales and marketing side. It was after a short stint. I was a naval officer right after college, an engineering officer. And after the Gulf War, I went to work in healthcare as a salesman and worked my way up into marketing and sales leadership. And I moved to within the health space to corporate affairs and privacy through a legislative perspective, largely into privacy. Right, I got involved in corporate affairs because the government and other large organizations were becoming decision makers. Right, and then as part of that, got interested in privacy because of the growing concern around that. And when I came to ADT, I came to help create the government affairs department, and I had the pleasure of working with the innovation team as part of our privacy structure. Maybe because of my marketing and sales background, or maybe just because I drew the short straw. I don't know. No, I was just kidding. I loved it, and it was great. And then a short time after that, I had an opportunity to move into the chief privacy role. Our Internet of Things connection is an extension at ADT of our traditional security industry, or security product offerings, rather. As consumers wanted to incorporate other devices into what they were using to provide their own security and automate their homes, it was a natural extension. And I got, and it was also a nice place for me to be involved because, again, some of the policy considerations and discussions that were taking place a couple of years ago in terms of, well, how do we transition more completely to broadband? Do edge providers have particular concerns under the national debate that was going on net neutrality? what type, as Internet of Things and the economic opportunity of Internet of Things has gotten understood or become understood or more understood, I should say, that draws in a lot of different interests. And so the whole policymaker, regulator, business development space began to embrace it. So all of those factors sort of pulled me in. I wouldn't say it was it wasn't one thing or something that I actually specifically went out looking to. It was just where the world wanted to move, and it's exciting. I like technology, and that's how I got here, and having fun with it.
Is healthcare to home security? How was that bridge made?
It's interesting. There's two, I think, driven by two things. First off, I wanted to come and have an opportunity to move to technology and to have an opportunity to create something. So that drew me into ADT, and then ADT, which is not well known by a lot of folks, is that ADT also has a health business unit. So we're in the residential space, business space, and we have a health unit, which is a natural extension of the hub that we have in the home.
Oh, I did not know that. So I was going to ask about B2B, but I had no idea there was a health component. Well, what is the health component for ADT?
So our health unit started, and historically it grew out of a very traditional personal monitoring device, like a PERS device. For listeners, that might be a common thing. There would be a I fallen and can't get up device, and as the technologies have developed, that's really those devices are now like on technology steroids. For example, these devices know when someone has fallen, right? Or at least because
you don't have to press a button.
Exactly.
Right?
There's an accelerometer into it. There's exciting things about using geolocation data to help locate somebody. So that particular aspect has really been a benefit of technology advances, but also with the hubs in the home, as technology evolves, it gives the ability to use devices so that consumers can be more educated and more in control of their own numbers, and there are opportunities for them to work more closely with their doctors and their hospital systems, and for hospital systems and doctors to work more closely with patients in a real time setting. And that's helpful because it can drive quality of care, and it can also help with things like when you come home from the hospital, maybe help address things like readmission rate. I mean, it's all developing, but that's the opportunity, and that's what drew me is that there's lots of noble causes actually in the Internet of Things and in advancing some of these things. And for me, it seemed like a technology extension of what I had been doing in healthcare.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of privacy issues there too. So why don't we jump in though? Let's get into privacy and IoT. Well, we've already have been, but in a little bit more way. What's your advice? What are some of the most important things that a manager, what do they need to know about in privacy in the context, I guess, of IoT?
Sure. This is an important question because I think no matter what the function is that someone's fulfilling in a corporation today or a company today, these things are crossing all sorts of lines, and in fact, purposefully crossing them and creating multi-stakeholder reviews and teams are really helpful to the notion of what we call privacy by design, and that is very similar to the discussion that's been taking place about security by design.
That's right. Yeah, I like
where you actually start with some of these things in mind. So, for example, start with understanding what data the devices are going to be collecting, right? And not and in complementary to the security issue. So you would want to know that so you know how to secure them. But in the privacy side, know that so you're thinking about things. Well, why are we collecting it? For what purpose? How are we going to be communicating that to the customer and explaining to them very transparently the overall service that you want you want us to provide for you? it needs this information. So this is what we're going to be collecting and how we're going to treat it, and under what terms are we going to keep it? How might you amend it? And then you start to take some of these other, as you're just thinking about your own using your managerial mind, then that leads up to, in many of those buckets, how do we do that in the best way? So, for example, one of the things I mentioned was communicating to the customer. So if you're a marketing manager and you're providing some type of services, you would have a lot to contribute to the privacy team about how we go out and talk to the customer in terms of our materials. This is what we're doing. And then also helping innovate in terms of how simply you communicate that to people so they understand it, and how you go about getting those consents. There's a role, literally a role for many different functional groups, and privacy committee and the makeup of privacy committees in the world today, I think, reflects that as not only a reality in terms of need, but also a recognition on behalf of companies in terms of who we're putting on our teams and how we're thinking about these issues, so that we try to do the best job with it, because ultimately it leads to trust, and the customer trust then ultimately helps lead to the product being used, so that you can deliver the value that is behind the whole effort anyway, right?
Yeah. No, but I think you bring up a good point, and this is this cross-functional point, because if you think about it even just a little bit, pretty much in every operational group, there is going to be a privacy component, right? And I mean, maybe in development it's more on the security side, but so if to paraphrase you, then think about privacy, in your role, perhaps join a privacy committee, perhaps contribute to privacy policy. Am I getting you, or what am I missing here?
No, that's absolutely right, and reflect your function's inputs and needs, but also it gives you perspective in knowing. I think the cross-functional sharing of the process actually is very, very. It's valuable to the organization, and it's also valuable to what's ultimately delivered to the customer.
Yeah, and so maybe even galvanizing this type of discussion if it's not happening already. Obviously, there's a whole spectrum of companies that are serving the IoT market, from startups to very large corporations, and maybe in startups they don't have this structure in place. So, even in the startup environment, talking about this, and I like your concept of privacy by design in parallel with security by design, just to get this top of mind, right? I mean, it seems like it has to be something that's thought about from the very beginning.
I think that's true. And, just like security by design, but there's a different nuance here. And maybe people may understand it. When we're trying to encourage this, across the development cycle, the functions and their influences change across the development cycle. For example, a marketing person's contributions over time, they change when the product might be first. They may, just to make my point, perhaps in the early stage, though marketing is critical, they may actually be a greater voice in strategies later on, but their input early on still matters. And why I'm saying that is you were trying to do this with the goal of having long-term customer trust, satisfaction, and brand loyalty, and various corporate functions and business functions play a different role at a different time across all those things. You were trying to do this with the goal of having long-term customer trust, satisfaction, and brand loyalty, and various corporate functions and business functions play a different role at a different time across all those things.
Right.
And so their emphasis points may be different, but you want to have everybody involved from the beginning and foster this inclusion so that you get all these various considerations at every phase, and they may be stronger from one function at a different phase, but they're just as important from every function. And when you operate that way, I think the environment is very rich, and you can be picking up and delivering upon what are some pretty wide-ranging privacy expectations over time. So.
Yeah, and I think just having different perspectives on that issue are going to, maybe you're saying this, but just unearth or uncover some points that maybe others didn't consider, and so getting everyone. But I think it's really a cultural thing. I mean, you've been predominantly, dealing with privacy in healthcare, and then with ADT. Do you think this is something? And I know it's hard to get away from the security side of this, but is this something that's prevalent in technology companies, or is this something, well, I don't know, what do you think?
Well, you mentioned that there might be smaller companies that are getting started, and there may be similar challenges to what we're talking about here, to security by design issues that have already been well raised in terms of the personnel that people have on board. And with that being said, my personal experience, even with, and I don't mean to exclude startups, because I've had the pleasure of talking with startups about these issues, and there's at least you'll find somebody with a good understanding. But I do think that this concept of privacy by design is not new. It is being adopted well, and there are other resources, et cetera, to help groups do it if they don't you mentioned the importance of culture on top of just manning and other resources. But I actually do think that there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about this. There are a lot of people doing it right and making it efforts to do it right. And I think we ultimately see that in some of the rapid advances. I mean, if we just think of some of the rapid advances in Internet of Things apps from a privacy perspective, right? Originally you would have, let's take a common thing about this challenge about getting folks to actually read the privacy policies, right? And how that was a challenge because it was written, one of the big early challenges was how long they were in the legalese. So one of the things I think that is evolving is you're seeing them using much simpler language now, right? Some of them are still long, but they're making an effort to use simpler language. How about some of the really neat stuff that user experience developers have incorporated for special things like, for example, before you and I started the call today, the technology that we're using asked me, do I want to turn on my phone and my microphone and my camera, right? Right. And that's kind of cool, right? And then we're also seeing people that are developing products, take that to another level where you're beginning to see the incorporation of visual indicators if a Bluetooth connection is made, at the top of your phone, you can see indications that, that your location is being used, right? So we have a long way I'm not suggesting we're anywhere near done, but these developments are coming with some fairly decent speed. If you think about it, right? Yeah. And that to me is a good thing, and it means people are innovating around them, and then through, as we already talked about, there's other mechanisms like IoT World and others to showcase these things and share them. And I think companies are doing a really good job about that. Now, gaps still to close, other things to still address, but there is a lot of things to take pride in and to recognize. Gosh, people are not exactly sleeping at the wheel here.
Yeah. Well, let's clarify things, because sometimes people bring or conflate security with privacy. How would you contrast the two? I mean, just to make it clear.
Well, they're very closely related, so it certainly is understandable where folks think, if I have security by design, I have privacy by design. To keep it simple, I think the privacy component, though both of these two sides will take credit for some of this. On the privacy side, we're thinking about what that data is and who should use it.
Mm-hmm.
On the security side, we're thinking about what the data is, and once it's decided that someone can use it, how do we get it to them?
Mm-hmm.
Once we decided that what the data set is that we'd like to collect because it can help our product better deliver the services the consumer wants, well, then how do we get that data to us securely is a security by design. And then once we have it, under what conditions are we using it is a privacy, and how are we talking and keeping the consumer abreast about that. That for me involves more of me, though I work closely with security folks and try to have a understanding of it so I can be one of these contributors that I talked about, these multifunctional contributors. The onus is on me to behave that way too, so I try to stay smart about that so I can talk to it and understand when people bring things up. It's not my space. I wouldn't be the guy who wants to guarantee things are locked down or moving correctly. But the privacy side, I am involved very much so in the robust discussion about what is it we want to use, how do we want to tell folks we're doing it, and under what conditions. So.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, security being more of a technical issue, and then privacy, you're defining policy, so it's more of a business issue, right?
Yes, and there's with the if you had those two circles, there's that center overlap area where the two groups are working together, and it's part of a strong link. You said that the outset in introducing me, you conveyed that I'm part of a team, and that's sort of like those Olympic rings and the strong chain, if you will. And so there's a number of functions involved, but that would be how I distinguish between the privacy and the security side of it in a way that I think can be readily understood.
Now, what about privacy and just, I guess, the bigger issue of liability? Because privacy is really, I mean, it's an indicator of a potential risk and a liability, but it's not the only one, right? So within ADT, are you looking at privacy within a risk structure, or is it separate completely from a liability or legal kind of liability structure? Or am I clear on this? I mean, do you see privacy as being a subset of risk, so it's more of it's underneath the legal umbrella because obviously you want to minimize the risk, or is it something that's completely separate?
I think it gets evaluated both ways. In terms of a risk evaluation, it's like any type of business decision you have to make is what is it you're trying to achieve? What are the inputs you're going to need to achieve it? And then what does that introduce, and what considerations are being introduced? So for example, if we're talking about PII and privacy, if we have a customer that desires us to provide a service and bringing on that service to them to meet their needs requires a certain piece of information from them, then we need to evaluate, well, is the benefit of providing it worth the risk of bringing that information in? And then, of course, that you couple that next to your framework for securing that information. But you do need to evaluate it because, as we're all well aware, not only is there I think the big risk that everybody would certainly understand is that the right types of information, other people might want to access that who aren't authorized to access it, and it needs to be protected, right? And the more that we're involved in the Internet of Things and the way that these devices and these services are being incorporated into people's lives and sharing information and collecting information that may not have been, historically done or culturally done. These are risks, and one needs to think about it. And then I think in terms of one of the reasons companies collect data is to improve products over time, to improve their services over time. And as all these devices begin to participate in the systems and more data is collected, there becomes risks that you have to evaluate in terms of, well, there's the security risk, and then there's our use risks, and all of that can then lead to various legal questions and things that you'll need to work through and all of that adds up to what requires a very careful evaluation of it. But ultimately, I think that it is a traditional risk analysis you're doing, is that you're trying to say, can we provide what folks want to do it? I mean, what folks want to buy and what they need to live their lives better, and is the requirements that we have to participate in that space, are they appropriate? Because you want to deliver a valuable product. You want the consumer to use it, right? You want to you want to meet their needs, and you're pursuing doing it better than anybody else in a competitive setting. You have to do a risk evaluation for it. But I think that's the trade-off all the time, right? And no data is bad. It's just what data do you need to use, and how are you going to use it, and what's the good that's coming out of it?
Well, let's look at it from another way. What are the high-level legal and regulatory issues surrounding this data, surrounding privacy and IoT? Because you want to use it in the right way. You also want to use it in a legal way. So what should our listeners be thinking about legally, regulatorily, if that's a word, with respect to IoT and privacy?
I think from a big picture point of view, a lot of it could be traditionally discussed, right? So we mentioned things like you need to certainly think about what type of data are you collecting and how are you communicating and getting consent to have that data, right? That's an important consideration. And then what processes do you have in place to keep that data fresh, if you will, and accurate, and then what this is heavily security related. What processes do you have in place to secure that data in accordance with the way you've communicated that you're doing so, right? And just like your usage. So all of that, I think, can be traditionally brought over from other regulatory discussions, applies. But it just applies so with the individual nuances around Internet of Things. And some of those individual nuances now is that they have these new special types of data. So, we mentioned PERS devices and geolocation tracking. So there's other data that may have certain sensitivities to it. People's personal health information, which has different regulatory, can, depending on how you're participating in that space, introduce additional regulatory requirements for people. There are, the Internet of Things allows you to, and this isn't new or specific to the IoT, but it's a global world now, and information is moving places. And there's issues like regulatory issues now about where you store data and cross-border use of data. These are things that always, existed, but they certainly are having attention paid to them because of the Internet of Things. And the types of data that are being collected. And then I think also, particularly in the security and home automation space, there are differences now being defined because of being in the home, right? And some of the way some of these technologies require information or introduce the opportunity to use different data streams to bring value to people, such as like video, audio collection. And now that it's you're not in a public space where you may have not had an expectation of privacy, but you're in your own home, and a place that you cherish and keep private, and that adds considerations. So, am I getting to your question? I hope I am.
Yeah, no, you are, and I guess I keep on going. I mean, obviously, there is the concept of do the right thing. Treat the data as if it's your own, so do the right thing with your data. But there also is the issue of what's the legal framework? What's the regulatory framework? And I guess what I'm wondering and asking you is for our listeners to make sure they're on solid ground with respect to privacy. Yes, do the right thing, and I think your gut will help you there. But how do they need to go to their lawyer? Are there other resources? But how do they know they're on a sure footing with respect to the law and regulations that are out there?
Sure. So I would say absolutely. And in that the earlier discussion we were having about the multi-stakeholder teams involved in privacy by design. That includes, if provided it's available to you, your internal legal counsel, and which could be residing in your privacy office. It could be in your business units, could be both, as well as outside counsel resources. So there is absolutely a need to be working just like you would through any business transaction with good legal representation and counsel, both generally and then also from specifically if you're headed into a new area or you're using one of these sensitive data types into specific expertise may be very appropriate. How would you know? I think there's some really good sources of information that one can touch on for free and at the fingertips. To get started, I think since we mentioned security by design and some of the regulators, there's some really good information that's out for example, available at the FTC about starting with security, and there's some fundamental privacy things that are related in that story, as well as the FTC as a nice report, as does the White House, has some information about big data and privacy, and both these can be accessed.
Okay.
We talked earlier.
And these are,
so go ahead.
So these are, I'll get these resources then from you and put them in the show notes so people can click to them and review them then.
Yeah. For example, the FTC back a number of years ago, they put out a book about, in the area of, I think it's titled something like The Era of Rapid Change and Big Data. And then, and I'll get that for you. And then we mentioned the Internet Society as part of in our early conversation, and they have done some really great work in terms of a white paper on the Internet of Things. It gives an overview. That's a nice piece because it talks about the security issues separate, and then privacy. It does have a section on liability and legal considerations. It's a really good piece. And again, that was part of my comment about why I think you'll find a lot of organizations and associations really getting this right and paying attention to it.
Okay, no, that's good advice.
Yeah.
That's good advice.
And then even at your own Informer programs, there's a lot of good resources there through other companies. And I made some great connections at IoT World that led me to more resources and had me thinking about trust models, et cetera. So I think just being involved in various professional organizations helps people get a lot of advice for free. You may have to dig deeper after you get it, but you know what I mean? But I think it points you in the right direction.
No, and I think that's important. I mean, I think everyone needs to just get on a certain foundation so that when they do go, I think, to seek legal counsel, whether that's internal or external, for smaller companies, obviously it would be external, then they kind of know what they're talking about and they can utilize those resources in a more, I guess, cost-effective way.
Yeah, they understand the issues and they've at least begun to think about some of the challenges.
Yeah, no, and I think that's good advice where there's some resources we can provide, and then also, like you were saying, the industry organizations and associations will be a good place to start as well.
Yeah.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to get your take. I mean, we've been talking pretty general, but what's your take on B2B privacy versus B2C? ADT, obviously a big part of it, so I didn't know about the healthcare side of it, but was more of a B2C. But is there big differences there?
Well, I think you ask a lot of. I think some of the questions that get asked are the same, but on the B2B side, you generally have good contract laws and considerations and going into place to protect people. The evolving space, at least from my perspective, and I think where a lot of the attention we've been talking about for the last number of minutes about in terms of regulators and policymakers does come in on the B2C side. And I think some of that is because not only related to challenges about collection and use and storage, which is important on the B2B side, and every vendor agreement, et cetera, and contract I've ever read is going into great detail on that and imposing contractual obligations on people. But on the B2C side, when you're working with the everyday consumer, this is where I place my attention and our focus is in my office, because folks don't don't always understand these things. So we
Sure.
need to work on helping convey it.
And they don't have their own personal lawyer looking at
exactly.
it.
Exactly. And businesses have well established redress mechanisms. And so the consumer, where do they rely? They rely on companies first and foremost that they're doing business with, and they vote with their pocketbook, if you will, and that's
Right.
important because companies want to deliver a valuable product, and certainly in our case, we'd like to do that long term, and it's helpful to the use of all of our services if people engage in them and get the most value out of them. So, we have those pressures, but then you also we've spent a little bit of time talking about the interest of policymakers and regulators. And for example, the FTC, that's a consumer focus.
Sure.
We made the recommendation that people could even engage with their policymaker through constituent affairs. These are consumer issues. And there's consumer protection laws, yes, and there's consumer protection mechanisms that are having this impact, which caused me and I think folks like me to put our attention in the B2C area.
And on the B2B area, is it more or less covered already with existing mechanisms?
Yes, I mean from my perspective, right? I better leave that up to some of my colleagues in the law department if they think there's some deficiencies. But from my perspective, I think and where my attention goes, it's on the B2C side.
Okay. And what about then within the B2C side? Specifically for smart homes, connected homes, home automation. Is there anything unique there with respect to privacy?
Well, as I sort of said, I think and in our particular space inside the home, it is unique in that this is the traditional place where people has a really high expectation of privacy, right, and they desire control. And in the services that we're offering, it's because someone is trying to enhance their life, but primarily they come to us because they're trying to secure their life. And it's this blending of, in our space where we may have traditionally been trying to protect somebody's physical assets. Well, now consumers are creating these digital assets, if you will, and developing and evolving their understanding about them. And so B2C and getting this right is such it occupies my time and gets my attention because we want to do this right so that we fulfill those obligations and expectations. So just like someone would stay with us and companies like us to secure things over time, we want to be partners with the consumer. And as I said, technology drew me into this field. The technology is exciting and looking forward to sort of delivering on that promise.
Yeah, but I think you brought up a good point earlier is when you're outside, maybe your expectations aren't as high, but when you're at home, you're in your own domicile, right? You expect things to be private. And it's interesting because I finally bought an Amazon Echo. It's being delivered today, actually. And here I am. I'm going to put this device right in the middle. Well, it's probably going to be in our kitchen area. But it listens, right? So, I don't know. They had to probably think about this a lot. I mean, I hear horror stories about, I don't know if it's horror stories, but stories about how the data is being collected and analyzed. Every single thing that's being said in the home is being collected and then analyzed and then not acted upon, obviously, unless there's certain key words. But this has got to be, this is pretty big, right? Because I think it's even more in the home, just like you said. You have to be even more careful because there is that expectation, or there's an expectation of privacy within your own four walls.
Sure, and these are exciting technologies, right? So you mentioned this particular experience you're going to have today because I'm sure you're excited about it, right?
Yeah,
and because it's going to deliver value to you and your family. And but then again, you'll want to understand what's going on. Another resource that folks could tap into, particularly that I think is helpful on this issue you're mentioning, is there's an organization out of DC called the Future of Privacy Forum, and they actually have a paper they've done about always-on listening devices, which helps people understand some of the differences and these technologies and may be of useful. So we'll be sure to list that in the resources that you make available too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, and I personally would be interested in reading that. And I'm going to be reading their privacy policy, and I'm assuming it's going to be nicely displayed on the outside of the box. But maybe I'll give people an update on that a little bit later on. Yeah. Well, Paul, why don't we close with this? I'm just looking for some advice. So some advice for management teams that are deploying IoT, let's say, into the smart home. What's your advice? What's the high-level advice that you would give them?
Well, I think to summarize the points I've already made is to build your review teams, your product design review teams, where you're starting right with the initial problem that you're trying to address, having multifunctional reviews taking place, and that you're involving broad stakeholder groups so that you get all the issues and think about all the things. I think I would also advise people to get a certain fundamental understanding and just do some minimal research, which is readily available. And we mentioned taking a look at the Internet Society, looking at the resources federal agencies make available. I've also think just some simple Googling about run a Google search about what types of factors are people putting into play when they make purchasing decisions. For example, the one you just made, you can find some relatively easy to read materials about how these technologies are advancing. So it's being informed, and then what I would say is I think it is important, particularly once you start to get an idea about what your particular areas of interest are in terms of questions about what it is you're trying to develop, then you get the specific advice related to that, and either from your internal counsel or external expert counsel, and I think that's a good way to get started.
Excellent. No, excellent advice. So you're saying effectively become familiar with the topic. Lots of free stuff out there. Lots of really good free stuff out there. Surround yourself in these discussions with different people within the organization, so you're getting different points of view, and then bring on some counsel after you've done that. When you're informed and you know your company's different, aspects or considerations, and maybe bring on someone, or not maybe, but bring on someone and make sure you're on the right track.
That's right.
Does that sound about right?
Exactly right. Do your deeper dives in the relevant areas, and I think that's a great way to get started.
Excellent. Well, Paul, how can people find out more about you and ADT?
Well, for those that are interested, you can find us at ADT on our website at ADT.com. We're on in the Twitter space at ADT. And I'm on all those formats. I don't have my own website, but you can find me on LinkedIn at Paul Plofchan, or on Twitter, and send me a note. I'd be happy to engage specifically with anybody that wants to dig a little deeper into something I've said, and I'd enjoy meeting folks that are interested in the IoT. And thank you, Bruce, for the time. I always enjoy chatting with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, thanks for your time, and we'll be talking soon.
Okie doke. Bye-bye now.
Okay, well, that was episode 62. Not a big fan of the number anyway. To get an analysis of this episode or any other episode, and to get the transcript, just go to the show analysis notes. They can be found for all episodes at iotinc.com/podcasts. Or this is episode 62 if you want to search it out. It'll generally be on the homepage if you're listening to this after it's just been released. Now, like usual, I asked for your help. I got one review since last time. Big news. So if you would like to share the love for this podcast, then please go to iTunes, and you have to be in the app, but go to iTunes and you can either just use 1 second and click a 5-star review if that's how you feel, or take a few more seconds and write a review. I read every single one of them. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your path to IoT business be a private one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.